Hello, today we have the readings for Trinity Sunday, and most of us, at least in the Catholic Church, are going to get to hear a homily about the technicalities of the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity or the Holy Trinity. And I'm sure we're all going to enjoy hearing that for the 50th or 60th time in our lives. So let me instead focus on just the first reading, which is from Exodus. And this is where God reveals his name to Moses. Um, an issue that comes up more often than I expected is people who maybe should otherwise know better will talk about the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. And they don't mean two separate gods, but what they mean is that the God as revealed in the Old Testament is somewhat of a stern or punishing God, and that the God of the New Testament is a loving God. And I'm here to tell you that that's completely false. The God of the Old Testament is every bit as loving as the God of the New. Now, there's two ways to look at this. One, I'm going to run through real quickly. One is that you look at the New Testament, see the God who loves so much, he gives his only son to save us from death. And then you realize other passages of the New Testament tell us that Jesus is the perfect revelation, the image of the Father. You see that in the prelude to the Gospel of John. You see that in Ephesians and Colossians, where Paul says expressly that Christ is the image of the invisible God. And so, what you do with that is to say, look, Christ clearly loved us unto death. Therefore, that is the image, correct image of the Father. It must always be that that is the correct image of the Father. That's a perfectly good argument, by the way, but you don't need to make it. Let's go back to the old parts of the Old Testament here in Exodus, and let's see what happens when Moses asks God to show God's self to Moses. Thus the Lord passed before him and cried out, the Lord, which of course in Hebrew, Yahweh, Yahweh, a merciful and gracious God, slow to anger and rich in kindness and fidelity. Say that again. The Lord, a merciful and gracious God, slow to anger and rich in kindness and fidelity. Kindness, loving kindness, used to be translated. Great translation of the Hebrew word chesed. Um, by the way, in the passage given to us in the common lectionary, they omit a verse, only they could do that, verse 7, which says that God is full of merciful love for thousands of generations and visits iniquity only down to 3 or 4 generations. So look at the difference. When they say that 3 or 4 verses 1,000, that's not a mathematical test. It means that God's mercy completely overwhelms whatever there might be of some sort of justice or anger. This is the Old Testament God. There's no vengefulness here. There's really hardly any judgment here, because if there was, we'd have a problem. You may wonder, then where does this idea come of the angry Old Testament God? Two places, okay? First, when the Israelite people are exterminating, and there's no other word for it, exterminating the non Israelite people, they attribute that to God. Well, maybe they shouldn't have. Second, you will see, of course, the prophets talk about punishing Israel for its infidelity. But what we keep forgetting is the prophet saying things like, well, I warned you and I warned you and I called you and I called you. And finally, the only way I could get your attention was to punish. Now, even that is an Old Testament notion, but again, look at the substrate there. This supposedly angry Old Testament God even then resorts to punishment only as a last resort. Then comes Jesus, and we see the loving Christ, the loving God. That's the God we have, the God we worship. That's why the gospel is called good news.